Hey, hello listeners. My name is Aubrey and I'm here with Robert
Block.
Do you want to say a few words about yourself and background, Robert?
Sure. I'm the Senior Vice President of Identity Strategy at SecureAuth. I have been in the identity management world for about 14 years. My goal is obviously to be a thought leader and evangelist for where we should go as an industry.
Outstanding. And my name is Aubrey Turner. I'm a Client Solutions Advisor at Optiv, focused on, of course, identity access management. And we have what I feel is a timely and a great topic today that we're going to be talking about, moving beyond the passwordless authentication. Again, a fantastic topic, and we're going to hopefully impart some knowledge and wisdom about where we are with passwordless and some solutions, and just preparing you for, again, the direction that we're hoping things will go.
Thanks again, Aubrey. So as Aubrey suggested in the intro, right, we're all here to talk about the password. So before we can tell you to move beyond the password, let's understand better why we want to move beyond the password. All right, so first and foremost, can we really rely on the password? I know for myself, I probably manage anywhere between 20 and 30 instances of user ID and passwords between my corporate world, my personal life, and even usernames and passwords that I manage now for my kids, right, who aren't necessarily old enough to manage them on their own. The statistics tell us that the average person manages over 25 active accounts online. And so we know because of that, people are probably using the same password across multiple accounts because they're trying to make it easier on themselves, or they're writing passwords down. So how reliable can either of those really be? I hope this second bullet isn't really true anymore, right, that people still use simple passwords like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I know that's bandied about a lot in the industry, but I hope with password complexity policies that becomes a misnomer and that isn't really truthful anymore. What the opposite effect has been, though, is with stronger passwords and password complexity policies. I don't know if you've seen this, Aubrey, but for me, I can't remember the difference. Did I have to have this special character or that special character? How many of this alphanumerics? How many nonverbals? Can't be a word in my family. Can't be a word in my own name, etc. Policies I run into where then my second factor typically nowadays is just to hit forgot password, have to go through the link of getting the email so I can reset the password in the first place every time I want to interact online. So are passwords really reliable?
Yeah, Robert, and I think I actually got you beat on the terms of the number of passwords. So in preparation for this, and I would challenge our listeners to do the same, right? So go into your password vault app, whatever it is you're using. I'm using one on my iPhone, right? And I went and just counted. I've got over 100 between work and personal. That is a lot of credentials. And I try to, best practice, and they're all complicated, right? So I use the setting in there that says, hey, give me the most complex password possible. So I'm not going to remember all of them, right, of course. But bottom line is a lot of passwords, and the economics of passwords is and again, we'll get into that, but certainly a lot of, the question, can we really rely on it? I'd say at this point where we are, we got to look at other options. We got to begin to think about some other.
So you mentioned the economics. Obviously, if your sheer volume is over 100, what about it, if we took a look at it from a hard corporate perspective, right? Even in my corporate world, I probably have 8 to 15 usernames and passwords, just depending on which company I worked for at what time in my life and where they were relevant to having other technologies like SSL in place, et cetera. Again, statistics tell us, not our data, 20 to 50% of help desk calls are due to password resets. You and I have in the past both conducted workshops with customers where we've walked in and asked them for statistical data around the percentage of call volume relative to account unlocks and password resets. Would you say you'd put faith in that number of 20 to 50%?
Oh, absolutely. But part of it, too, is if they can even get it. So if you walk in the door and ask them for it, they may not even have it readily available. And that's part of the challenge. I mean, we do a lot of these workshops, and it's sometimes when you ask for that data, they look at you and say, like you're asking for, the theory of relativity or something. So part of it is just getting access to the information. But once you have it, Robert, I couldn't agree with you more that, yeah, I'd say that cost is that cost range there is pretty accurate. And even if it's not, in that range for you, it's some variable, it's some cost, and you got to look at that.
Right, then you've got to take every one of those that make up that percentage and figure out what are you paying hard dollar. I mean, every help desk service manager knows what they're paying hard dollar costs. I mean, if they're outsourcing in North America, maybe it's $12 a call. If it's outsourced offshore, maybe it's $3 a call. If it's on internally hosted and managed and employed, maybe it's $6 a call. So, can you put faith in the $525,000 a year number? I don't know, right? I tend to focus more on percentages, but the easy math is there for organizations if they can capture, to Aubrey's point, how many account unlocks and resets they have. The math is there to understand hard dollars they're spending every year on economically or not so economically managing the password. So we've talked about password usability. We've talked about the economics of passwords. Are passwords really secure? Again, not our data. If we just look at what the Verizon breach report has been telling us since 2012, the incidents involving passwords has gone up exponentially from 48% in 2012 to 81% in 2017. Now, I will say with a disclaimer, right, there are lots of other areas that the Verizon breach report tracks relevant to breaches, RAM scraping, spyware, and phishing. But you tell me, wouldn't you say that even in those three areas, there has to be some credential involved in the breach in the first place?
Yeah, at this point, Robert, I really don't know that the breaches that are occurring without credential theft. I mean, that just seems to be the predominant way, right, that the bad guys are gaining access. Got to be some element of credential theft in these incidents. And again, if you go back historically over the Verizon breach report, you track this stuff, I think you'll see that pattern emerging. And that's really the main point here, is that pattern of credential theft has only increased over time, and we see that manifesting itself again in these incidents. So, yeah.
All right, so you heard us earlier, right? 81% of all breaches involve stolen credentials. Again, that's what the Verizon breach report is telling us. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the anatomy of a data breach, but ultimately their whole goal is to get in the environment. Once they're in the environment through any credential, is escalate using that credential to a privileged credential, and then have some east-west lateral movement, steal as much data and or harvest more credentials as possible, and then their mission is complete. The odd part about that mission complete is we don't know if that's 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year.
Right.
Until the credential no longer works, right? Why would their mission ever be complete?
Exactly. The bad guys could be in the environment for any period of time before somebody finally figures it out. But, Robert, to an earlier kind of point you made, you may even debate that 100% of breaches involve some kind of stolen password, right? I mean, you could make that case. Could you not?
Sure, and what's weird is we spend, as IT organizations, again, the Verizon breach report told us last year, $80 billion on endpoint, network, and identity management, security. Oddly enough, out of that $80 billion, only $5 billion was allocated to identity management. So the math, just doesn't work. That 81% of the breaches involves credentials, yet a fractional amount, less than 20% of the overall spend in security, is spent on something that can't be stopped by network or endpoint. It's all about identity management and all about the credential.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So what have we been trying to do to fix this problem? Historically, we've been trying to use Twofactor to fix that problem. So let's just level set real quick. What do we mean by two-factor authentication? Two-factor is all about you having your first factor, right, that knowledge-based username and password, and now you're layering in a second factor. Sometimes it's also knowledge-based, like a challenge and response question or a public searchable question and answer. Is this you? Do you recognize this? Other times it's a hardware token or a one-time password. Other times it's biometrics. In fact, it could be all three of those and any combination of those within an organization. So what we encounter when we try to use two-factor or the variety of methods in two-factor is we encounter this usability issue. So we conducted a study at SecureAuth. We asked for a third-party organization a year ago to conduct a study for us. They spoke to a few hundred different prospects and customers about the deployment of two-factor authentication. And the bottom line is 42% of IT decision makers worry that two-factor will disrupt users. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I mean, just personally as well as professionally, my usage of multi-factor or two-factor authentication, yeah, I think it can be seen as disruptive. Now, I'm a security practitioner. I need to maintain good practices, kind of like being a dentist with rotten teeth, right? Rotten teeth, excuse me. You kind of have to practice what you preach. But to our end users, they certainly could see that as being disruptive, and maybe there's some alternate means that they would take. And again, as we all know, right, you've got to have the right balance. And if you have too much security, people will inevitably find a way to circumvent it. So, yeah, two-factor can certainly be disruptive to the average user and our consumers.
So if we know two-factor has usability issues, does it have security issues? So here's the different factors available in the open industry today. One-time password via SMS and email, hard tokens, knowledge-based questions and answers, or push-to-accepts. Well, NIST put out a study. I want to believe now it's 2014 the study was published, maybe 2015. I get my ears confused at this point, where they've told us flat out that they no longer recommend the use of one-time passwords via SMS and email. It is, phones are too clonable, it's too hackable, it's not a secure method of exchange, and those one-time passwords and SMS email codes are being intercepted. Tokens are expensive to maintain and have been compromised in the past. To what degree? I mean, I don't know that I care to debate whether it's 1%, 10%, or 50% of the tokens are compromisable. Go out and ask Google, and Google will find you articles relevant to where people's hard tokens have been compromised in the past. Knowledge-based questions, I mean, I don't even think we have to really talk about how insecure those are. The more information we put on social media today, the more we make our profiles public, the more we want to be seen, heard, and found, the more our knowledge-based questions and associated answers can be picked apart.
Yeah, Robert, I'll just add to that, and forgive me, guys, for not knowing the specifics, but you can look this up. There were some researchers who just published that the mobile phone protocol, this has been a known issue in the mobile phone network systems, that there's been a vulnerability that can allow an attacker to intercept and represent multi-factor or two-factor, right? So there have been some known vulnerabilities, and to Robert's point, that two-factor may not be as secure. I think in this particular instance was European, some of the European cell phone companies. But again, known issue that has proven to be two-factor, can be compromised. And in this case, the bad guys were after banking financial information and really the money, right? That's the end game. So again, two-factor method is not secure enough. No need to further beat that dead horse, so to speak.
So what does that leave us with? It leaves us with this balancing act, right? So now we're trying to juggle, how do I do things securely from an authentication perspective? How do I make sure it's as seamless and easy to use by my end users as possible? How do I not disenfranchise my customers and impact brand loyalty, et cetera? How do I balance both effectively? Back to the Wakefield study, we think part of that balancing act is going passwordless. So we asked during the study, would you like to consider doing away with passwords in the next 5 years? 70% of the IT decision makers interviewed in that Wakefield study came back and said, of course, yes, I'd like to do away with passwords. But most of them then said, but how? What does that look like? What does that include? So we advocate for the idea that going forward, all solutions must focus on the prevention and misuse of stolen credentials. We believe that every organization willingly will admit they have stolen credentials or just hasn't discovered yet they have stolen credentials. I don't believe there are any organizations left today that don't have some amount of credentials living somewhere on the dark web and or have already been used or owned by someone from a breach perspective. So these solutions need to be able to increase security but do it in a manner that users aren't aware. Need to be able to only require 2FA if there's some risk tolerance known to have been violated, right? The idea around 2FA being very binary today is what impacts usability the most. They need to work within your existing infrastructure. We don't want to have to go out and buy additional widgets and pieces to make things work. Essentially, there needs to be a new level of adaptive authentication obtained that allows you to find that balance between usability, security, and the removal of what is a terrible credential known as the password.
But Robert, I'll add, and again, this is a little foreshadowing for our listeners, the risk tolerance. I think that was a key part of what you just said. And we'll talk about risk tolerance because I think that's going to drive a lot of whether in 5 years these organizations that really want to go passwordless, how and whether or not they'll be able to get there. Is that risk tolerance piece cannot be understated. And again, just a little foreshadowing for our listeners in, again, some of the upcoming content that we'll talk about.
And so you can see on this graphic, and then I'll dive into sort of a visualization of what it looks like, right? We have 2FA. Adaptive authentication isn't new, right? It's been around for almost 10 to 12 years at this point. What we're really describing now is a scenario where there needs to be a new level of adaptive authentication provided within the industry today. And so I won't walk through each one of these bullets. In fact, I talked to some of them on the last slide, right? We need things to be more user-friendly. There needs to be more layers of depth of feature-rich adaptability rather than maybe just someone's network and or someone's geolocation. There needs to be numerous layers that can be used to thwart malicious use and then prevent that misuse. And so let's kind of walk through what that looks like. So I talked about already before the layering of factors to increase security, right? You had the single factor, then you had two factors. We talked about the various methods of two factors. That's what 2FA used to look like. What I'm suggesting going forward is we need a solution that looks like this. Here's that single factor. Here's that two factor. What if I could layer in a risk-based pre-auth analysis that would allow me to do away with all knowledge-based relative information in the authentication process? I know, sit down, I probably shocked everybody. They saw a bunch of red circles like, what? I can't get rid of my username. I can't get rid of my password. I can't get rid of stuff I know. I've been using it for 12 years. I understand. But that risk...
Longer than that.
But that risk pre-auth, unbeknownst to the user analysis, is what allows us to trust that we could get rid of those knowledge-based things that are so hackable, crackable, and easy to get to today. Then, if we find something in the risk analysis that says, hey, I trust you, but like only a little bit, I'm going to then ask you for that second factor, right? So now we've moved the factors we like, to some extent, into being the primary factor, right? That one-time password, that push to accept, something besides your known password as a factor of authentication. And now the second factor becomes something else in addition to what that first form factor was, if the risk analysis finds us some deviation in normality that tells us, hey, we probably should step you up. So what are those risk layers? As you can see by this slide, there are a lot of them. I believe there are 9. I am not going to walk you through every one in any great detail on this podcast because you would at least probably have fallen asleep twice. What I am going to do is just talk to you in generalities around what some of them mean so you get some understanding of how we might use them in the use case that we describe here in a few moments. So the first one being device recognition. Right? If I can, during your authentication process, capture a profile footprint of your device, mobile device, laptop, whatever device it is you're coming from, if I can gather that footprint, I can then look at the next device you come from, and I can decide, again, based on policy, should I step you up immediately because it's an unknown device? Should I then change device profile? Should I add this to your device profile? I can use device recognition to start to build normalities about you. second piece, threat intel, evaluating your IP address, evaluating your network environment, evaluating the subnet you're coming from, evaluating where that's coming from. All of those pieces of information around the authentication, again, helps further vet, is this normal for you? And if not, what should we do about it? And we've learned that 16% of breaches are orchestrated by attackers logging in from known C2 servers. So if it's a command and control server, what else can I learn about what's happened prior to getting to that server so that I can understand how to use that in the context of authentication? So not only from a threat service are we concerned about command and control servers, we're also worried about the dark web and attackers logging in from the dark web and attackers coming from known anonymous browsers like Tor. So the idea is doing that analysis, right? So if they're coming from what you accept as a corporate standard for browsers and then they start to come from a non-acceptable browser format, you can start to factor that into the risk analysis process. We can also look at things like behavioral biometrics, where we can start to provide some identity proofing and trying to get to a layer of assurance that's 99% accurate, that is the person based on swipes and clicks and pressure points. We also can integrate with identity governance solutions from a layering perspective, so we can start to learn around how you're using your credentials. Are they being certified in a timely manner? Can we use that as a way to say, hey, if they're authenticating and they've been certified recently, that's good for us? We also can use a lot about you from a location perspective, right? Whether it's the current location you're in versus coming from some international location, whether it's we've put a fence around where we expect you to come from and you're outside that geofencing boundary, or whether it's geovelocity where you logged in from New York and now 8 minutes later you're logging in from China or logging in from California, where we know from a velocity perspective you couldn't have in any reasonable semblance gotten there. And so now we're trying to step you up based on some hit relative to geography. Not recording. We can also do things like look you up in the directory, right? If the organization uses group management from a directory perspective, if you have certain attributes about you in an Active Directory that should tell us whether you have access to what you're trying to request in the first place or not, it's just one more layer of information we can use in the pre-auth risk perspective. I can look at your phone and I can get carrier information back from your device during the authentication request if you're coming from a mobile device. I can learn from that carrier, is this a North American carrier, because that's who you're expecting to come from. I can learn device ID and map that to the user ID if I can look you up in a directory. I can understand if this number has recently been ported. I can understand if this is coming from an international carrier that this number has recently been subscribed to. That helps us eliminate or reduce the potential for phone cloning. If you don't think this is a reasonable risk because this is more emerging, I challenge you to go out to YouTube and just type how to clone someone's phone. There's a great 2.5-minute video that when you hang up, you'll probably want to turn your phone off and not turn it back on the rest of the night. And then ultimately, we can use things like UBA to try to understand behavioral profile inside applications. And so if you're trying to do something abnormal, even post-authentication, during the continual evaluation process of authentication, we can use that data to help us understand whether we should continue to associate that authentication. So as you can see from these slides, the idea is we can use numerous layers of pre-authentication risk analysis, unbeknownst to the user, to decide how much we trust that user and what authentication experience they should see.
And Robert, man, I gotta say that all sounds brilliant, right? Taking a user through all these different pre-authentication risk analysis makes a ton of sense. Is this going to add a lot to the time, the authentication experience? Is this going to corrupt the authentication experience from a time perspective or impact usability? Like, hey, I'm going to be delayed now accessing my corporate network. What's your sense of that?
So if you think the idea is you're going to click username, submit, and then go get a cup of coffee and come back and be authenticated, no. This happens in milliseconds. These products, this solution set is built to have this happen unbeknownst to the user and in a non-impactful way into the organization. And I also should stipulate, I don't know that anyone has to have all 9 layers. Right. You can certainly have all 9 layers. And again, I don't think that would significantly impact the authentication process. You could have 5, you could have 4. I don't even know if everyone would be relevant to every use case, right? You can do some for consumers, some for third parties, some for enterprise. The idea, though, is that we should move to an industry that mandates the use of adaptive authentication so that we can do things like remove the password. I mean, look at this guy. That's what passwordless authentication looks like, man. Kickback, productive, field of dreams. Right? Gartner tells us in 2019 the use of passwords and tokens in medium-risk use cases will drop by 55% due to the introduction of recognition technologies. And again, that's not SecureAuth or Optiv saying that. That's Gartner saying that. All I want to do is I want to beat them to the punch. I want to make them wrong. I want to make it in 2019 77% were due to the introduction of recognition technology.
Yeah, so that guy looks like he's chilling, Robert. But what's really going to get our listeners and others to take the plunge? And I'll also preface it by saying we know there's like some limited industries that are doing passwordless authentication, right? Those of us that have been to a hospital may have seen that clinician do a tap and go thing to access the system. Those of you that are veterans or still in the armed forces, you may have had that experience with some kind of CAC or PIV card, so you may be aware of that as well. But the rest of us just haven't caught up, right? I mean, day to day, right? We're still using user ID and password. So what's going to take the rest of us to help beat that Gartner statistic? What's it going to take for us to take the plunge?
I don't think you could have gave yourself a better segue to answering the question for our end users.
So, folks, this is, again, some pretty straightforward math, and the calculator is available, and you can kind of go out there and plug in the numbers, right? And again, we talked about the economics of the password. We know they're expensive. We know that people will circumvent them, find ways to circumvent them, write them down. It's expensive for your help desk team to do password resets, and hopefully, again, you can go out and find that data. But if you plug it in to this calculator, the math is pretty straightforward. Again, we know the passwords are expensive, and on the flip side of that, removing the disruption has benefits. So again, I'll encourage you to go in and plug in your specific numbers to the cost savings calculator and see what you can save by potentially removing passwords. And for Robert's segue, I mean, there's nothing like dollars and cents, right? You may have heard that saying, if it don't make dollars, it don't make sense. This is one of those scenarios where it makes sense because it will make dollars to go ahead and explore and at least begin doing some of the math and doing some of the homework to remove passwords. Further thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I would concur. There's an economical case to be made if you're finding the belief behind 20 to 50% or more of your service desk calls are relative to account unlock or password changes. So, Aubrey, why don't you walk us through the idea of risk tolerance, right, and how an organization might put that in practice? What's that potentially look like practically to them?
Yeah, so Robert, going back to when I asked you, hey, is this going to add any delay, or is this going to delay or disrupt the authentication experience? And you cleverly showed me the picture of that guy just relaxed. He's already authenticated. But I think the main point there was you don't necessarily need to use all of the pre-authentication risk layers, right? You pick and choose the ones that are specific to the scenario, right? The user being authenticated, right? So you see some different criteria here: normal day, travel day. Somebody's got a lost or stolen laptop, stolen credentials, stolen laptop, etc. And then, of course, you've got to take a risk-based approach to this like anything else and understand what your risk tolerance is for these different scenarios and which of the pre-authentication risks you apply to each of those scenarios. So, and again, I don't want to necessarily go through each of these, and I'm not going to do that, but clearly you can kind of see the red and green in the different scenarios, and I'll take that first one. So on a normal day, right, all of these pre-authentication risk scenarios, they're checked green. So you allow the user access, and again, that certainly could be a passwordless. We hope it's a passwordless authentication experience, right? That's what we're talking about here. Skipping over to that stolen credential scenario, again, we are likely going to employ each of these criteria to make a decision about whether this person gets access. And in this scenario, we're going to deny them because, again, we understand it's a stolen credential. So, but that's all about risk and understanding your environment, your users, the devices, all of those things, the applications. And again, lots of different factors that'll go into this. But again, understanding your specific risk tolerance, putting that into practice, understanding which of the pre-authentication scenarios you want to employ to, again, help make sure that your environment is as secure as possible.
Yeah, and I'll just say, right, it's meant to be progressive. I mean, if you pick a solution provider like SecureAuth who has taken a more progressive approach to adaptive authentication, if you're picking a product that has numerous layers of adaptive so that you can have the flexibility in understanding which ones are applicable to your scenarios and which ones are not. And then ultimately, if you pick a product that uses workflow-based concepts rather than strict rule-based policies, you can build progressive layers of tolerance for your organization. You also want to get to a point where you are challenging for authentication, and then based on what you're learning pre-authentication, you're either, I'll call it stepping down, right? So I'm allowing single sign-on to applications because I loved everything about what happened in the pre-auth experience. I'm stepping up because I had some distrust, some hairs on the back of my neck, if you will, from what I learned during the pre-auth. So now I'm just going to ask you for a second factor so that I can try to understand if I can tell more about you are who you say you are and you're trying to use these credentials properly. And also you want to get to a point where you're saying, I don't believe you have appropriate intent and use of this credential, and so I'm going to deny, and then I'm going to redirect, and at the same time I'm going to push a notification out to something, right? If you've integrated with the provisioning system, now maybe I can scramble that password altogether, and then I can wait for a real user to call, and I can explain to him we think we have a compromised credential. I may send notification to the SIM team. I may send notification to the compliance team. I may send notification to the administration team while I'm scrambling that password so that people can take a more proactive approach to analyzing misuse and preventing misuse, because that's what we're really all about when we're trying to get rid of passwords, is we're also trying to prevent the ultimate misuse of that stolen credential.
Yeah, and I think, Robert, also this is about, the relationships that our identities have to our organizations, right? What's your relationship with the particular target that you're trying to authenticate to? And I think as our clients and consumers of technology understand those relationships and understand those relationships from a risk basis, right, and put these things into practice, you can make better decisions. I like the story that our colleague kind of shared, or the analogy that David Lee gave related to a stranger coming to your door and looking through the peephole and not knowing who they are and maybe not answering the door, but maybe you got a call from a neighbor and this is a new person to your neighborhood and said, hey, so-and-so just moved in, they're coming to stop by. Maybe when that stranger comes to your door, there's a little bit more familiarity there and you may crack the door, you may let them in because, again, based on the relationship. And that's, again, a sort of a rough analogy of understanding the relationships your identities have to the organization, understanding the risk of those identities, and applying the appropriate sort of security controls.
So you've done a great job of helping our listeners understand how to develop risk tolerance and how to put that into practice. What else do they need to consider?
Yeah, there's some pretty straightforward stuff, Robert. And again, some really kind of simple things that I would want our listeners to just be aware of, right? If you really want to go passwordless, if you want to help us beat that Gartner 2019 statement, right? Here are the things that you need to look at. So technical considerations. What does your infrastructure look like? Is it compatible with a passwordless strategy? You have a SIM deployed. Robert talked about, hey, feeding information to your SIM for correlation. And again, many of our clients already have SIMs, but still understanding that. Does your user community operate smartphones? And in this day and age, we may assume that everyone and all of our, from a corporate perspective, everyone's got a smartphone. And that's not necessarily the case, though. I've certainly been in the front door of some of our clients where the employee's workforce may not be issued a smartphone or for personal or any other reason, an employee may not want to provide their smartphone for work purposes. So that's a sort of an obvious thing that you kind of need to understand. So where are you from an operational perspective as it relates to smartphones? Would you need to issue smartphone devices to your employees? So those are the technical considerations. Then on the security side, do you already have adaptive deployed? And then which two factors will become factors for your authentication? Certainly those are some kind of security considerations. And this is really the critical part from hey, I really want to go passwordless. And by the way, I've certainly had more recent conversations with clients who are seriously interested in going passwordless, right? So this topic is certainly gaining traction, gaining momentum, and I talk about these points and try to, and I love the excitement, but you got to temper that with the reality, right? So the last couple things here around end user considerations. Doing pilot, can't stress that enough. A rolling deployment, simple thing, right? How are you going to enroll users? If you're going to do passwordless and you've selected your factors of authentication, what type of stringency or certification do you need around the enrollment process, right? Do you actually need to go out if you selected, some kind of biometric for the enrollment? Do you actually need to go out to the user community and collect that biometric, or is some other enrollment process okay? And I go back to that risk tolerance thing. That's where those risk tolerances kind of come into play. So the rolling deployment, understanding how you're going to enroll users into the passwordless scenario, and of course in-depth training. You're not just going to deploy this and instead of that, if you guys go back a few slides or recall a few slides, the guy was kicked up on his desk, likely to be somebody in a more frustrated position and not as relaxed. So to mitigate that, of course, in-depth training. How does the passwordless solution that you've selected work, right? Is it a biometric? Is it whatever it is, right? So pilot, understand you're going to do a rolling deployment. How are you going to enroll users, first of all? And then, of course, in-depth training. I think those are the kind of the high-level things that you should begin thinking about if you're serious, and hopefully you are serious about going passwordless. Robert, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I would just say that I hope the takeaways from all of this are going passwordless doesn't mean going two-factor. It's the reason why it's called two-factor is because password is the primary factor. What we're trying to describe here is bringing what used to be two-factor forward as the primary factor and using adaptive authentication as a mechanism to decide whether you should ask someone for a second factor or not. And number two, you said it earlier, I just want to repeat it again, we're not advocating you remove every single password from your user experience. Right? We're not saying you go from managing users who have 8 to 15 corporate username and passwords today, and now they have 0 tomorrow. But imagine a world where you could reduce that by half. If I could take your 8 to 4, if I could take your 15 to 7. The idea that I can impart some increase in security, reduce the threat landscape, as well as making the end user experience more plausible, isn't that a win for every organization?
Yeah, Robert, I would definitely say so. And I think, too, I don't know, hopefully you'll agree with this, too, Robert. Those of you that have already have substantial SSO deployments, so maybe you've already gotten the number of user ID and password combinations down to 1 or 2. Going passwordless is still a direction you can go in. The benefits of the pre-authentication risk analysis alone, I think, are worth investigating that, right? Because even that one password, you can, and that's been a knock on single sign-on, right? Now you've got one user ID and password that if compromised, you could gain access to a lot more things, right?
Oh yeah, we could do a whole other webinar on putting adaptive in front of SSO.
Right.
You want to make SSO secure but still real end user and friendly? Layer adaptive authentication.
Exactly, with passwordless authentication. So again, hope this was a constructive and helpful topic and conversation for our listeners. There is an opportunity for our listeners to provide feedback. When this podcast gets posted, there is a mechanism for you all to ask questions and, again, provide us feedback. We're really interested to hear from you. Thoughts, questions. Again, if this is certainly open for debate, and again, ultimately, we would like to hear from you. And then one last thing that I'd like to ask, if you want to hear more about passwordless and other identity and access management topics, please join us at the Cloud Identity Summit, June 19th through the 22nd in Chicago. We'll be talking about passwordless as well as a host of other relevant, timely identity access management topics. And from myself, I'd like to thank Robert Block for his time, and look forward to doing this again with you, brother. So.
Listen, Aubrey, it's been a fantastic experience, a great back and forth and dialogue. I think we should contact the Food Network and see if they'll let us host the cooking show together. So.
Outstanding.
All right, have a great day.